Hello, welcome again to Theology 333, Black Theology, Black Church, the African American Religious Experience. I'm Dr. Greg Jones, and I'm going to be bringing you another session today, a lecture session. You should have read chapters 5 and 6 of the Wilmore text. That's this text right here. We'll be taking some notes from that, and then we will also be talking today about some of the development of the black theology, theological leadership in this session. Let's get some historical kinds of understandings in the development of this particular period of time. This is during, right before, during, and after the Civil War. Remember, the Civil War was one of the bloodiest wars fought in this country. It's a very, very interesting kind of conflict that takes place, and I want you to be reminded that contrary to the popular notion that the African American community was in fact this was the reasons for the Civil War. This is not the reason for the Civil War. The Civil War was an economic war. It had to do with the South being economically independent and the North wanting to be able to control and have access to the resources that the Southern plantation aristocracy had developed. We talked about this before in our lectures before, but I just want you to remind you that slavery was not the issue of the war. It became part of the issue because of the nature of slave labor capitalism. That is to say, the population of slaves were in fact enforcing the independence, economic independence of the South and the Southern plantations, the North wanting to control that. Thus, it becomes a conflict that includes the freeing of the slaves in order to maintain or gather control of the Southern economic marketplace. And so this war is fought. It has hundreds, millions of people involved. It's a war. It's a horrible war. It's a war that is being fought primarily between the North and the South. It's being primarily fought on land. I won't go into the technology of the war, but because of the technology, the weapons technology of that time, take my word for it, it's a very bloody and brutal and gruesome encounter that we see taking place. Families were separated. Brothers were fighting brothers. Cousins were fighting cousins. People who lived in the North, who had family in the South, found themselves in conflict with one another. Slavery was not the issue, as I said. It was the economic independence of the South that was being struggled for. And we still see a struggle taking place in this kind of way in our country today even. Okay, during this particular time, I want to share with you the development of what we would call the black nationalist perspective in the 19th century. We see we talked last time about Douglass, and we talked about how Douglass becomes one of the first black nationalist heroes. And I gave you some information on Douglass. He started the North Star. He was part of the abolitionist or anti-slavery church, which is the advocacy church. We talked a little about that. And then we talked about how Douglass essentially in three autobiographies kind of spanned it Civil War, a Civil War, and a post-Civil War kind of existence. He eventually dies kind of in the saddle in terms of working with Ida B. Wells, dealing with some issues in terms of women's suffrage and dealing with the issues of lynching. We'll touch base on that a little later. But he was one of many individuals that were starting to emerge in the African American community, out of the African American church, who we could see began the, we can say the attitude about black nationalism or black people for black people, the black perspective, the African American nationalist perspective, we begin to see emerge during this particular time. Paul Coffey, for example, and let me tell you about a couple of individuals. Paul Coffey is kind of a ship captain. He felt that blacks would never be treated right in America, and he was an advocate of immigration. We also see whites being involved in immigration of black slaves or free slaves back to Africa. The Reverend Samuel Hopkins, a former slave owner, in fact, devised a plan to return slaves back to Africa. He was supported by a guy that started something called the American Colonization Society, the ACS, the Reverend Robert Finley. These Europeans, along with Paul Coffey and others, attempted to establish a return of slaves to the west coast of Africa, the American Colonization Society. The ACS was founded in 1816 and is said to be a supporter of ex-slaves in the founding of the country of Liberia, the Liberia in West Africa. The most famous that I am familiar with, that I've heard a lot about, is the Lot Carey missionary. Lot Carey's efforts basically established the colony of Liberia. Lot Carey was born in 1780 and he lived to 1828, was Baptist and by far a supporter, one of the best supporters of black immigration to Africa. Lot Carey, you still have Lot Carey missionaries in the Baptist denominational community. We still have missionaries all over the world. But Lot Carey himself was a famous missionary that brought freed black slaves back to Africa. We want to continue to talk about people like Martin Delany, a nationalist who said basically, I would rather be a free heathen than a Christian slave. He was born in 1812 in Charleston, West Virginia. Delany studied medicine. Martin Delany, R. Delany, the son of free blacks, well, he wasn't a clergyman. He worked with Frederick Douglass on the North Star. He started his own publication, The Mystery, and was a supporter of black missionaries to Africa. He rejected the ACS. The ACS was about trying to get whites to kind of convert blacks in Africa. He rejected that. He felt that blacks ought to be black missionaries to Africa. He was not a clergyman himself, but he supported black missionaries to Africa. He wrote a particular article that addressed this issue. It's called The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States Politically Considered. Martin Delany, one of the first very forceful nationalistic voices, black nationalism voices that we see in America. The difference between Delany and, let's say, Frederick Douglass is Frederick Douglass was with the advocacy or the anti-slavery church. Delany was basically pro-black nationalism. He felt that, white people did not have black people in their interests. And so he gives us the first indication and understanding of a black nationalist perspective. Another young man by the name of Alexander Cromwell founded the American Negro Academy, another early 19th century black nationalist. He was an Episcopal minister, born in New York in 1819, friends with Henry Highland Garnett, spokesman for black pride and solidarity. He was ordained a priest in 1844, worked as missionary to Liberia, felt blacks ought to care and love themselves. He died in 1898. He was a very interesting young man. He talked about the development of a way of blacks organizing themselves together and dealing with the issue of black solidarity. American Negro Academy, Alexander Cromwell. Edward Wilman Biden was a West Indies propagandist. He was born August the 3rd, 1832 in the West Indies, Virgin Islands, St. Thomas. He went to Liberia as a missionary, was president of Liberia University, educator and scholar. He studied with Carter G. Woodson and W.E. Du Bois. Essentially, those three helped create the Black History Month and Day and Week movement, the Black History movement, studying the past. Biden was a very, very, very prolific writer about the African antiquity and the past. Helped create the support for the origins of where blacks were coming from, of civilization. where black people were dealing with the issue of understanding their roots. We also see during this particular time, we see Edward Biden being a part of a group that deals with the Hermetic hypothesis. That was a group of individuals. There was a group of individual scholars, black scholars, intellectuals that were addressing the issue of the Hermetic hypothesis. That was the hypothesis that was used by Europeans to say that blacks were the descendants of the sons of Ham, and essentially they had been cursed, and that's the reason why they were enslaved. They were enslaved because they were being touched by the historic biblical curse that takes place when Ham looks upon his father's nakedness. And so we see that curse in Genesis, we see that in the Bible, and we see that's being used in the 19th century to qualify the use of blacks as slaves and the slavery, the oppression of black people. And there was a whole group of African-American scholars who said, no, that's not true. They repudiated the argument that God had forsaken black people by permitting them to be enslaved in America. Black preachers and intellectuals addressed this racist perspective and wrote their own perspective of blacks instead coming from a civilization position. In other words, this is the first time we begin to get information that blacks were a part of the origins of civilization, and blacks, we start hearing information about Kemet, we start hearing information about Egypt and Ethiopia, and we start seeing famous statements that black intellectuals are starting to make about how blacks, Ethiopia is going to stretch open her hands and embrace the world in terms of African and African American people, a kind of development of a pride and a understanding that blacks were not enslaved always, that they come from a very famous and a very impressive civilization origin. We also see Henry M. Turner coming into the scene. Henry M. Turner was born free in South Carolina in 1834. He was ordained in the Methodist Church. He was trained in Baltimore to be a African Methodist Episcopal pastor. He was a chaplain in the Union Army during the Civil War. Bishop Turner was elected bishop in 1880, and Bishop Henry Turner was the first to raise the issues of reparations. We hear about reparations today. It wasn't something new that we hear. It didn't start with Trans-Africa. It started with Bishop Turner raising the question about the repayment of blacks, slaves who were used to build up this country in the 17th and 18th centuries. And Bishop Turner raises this issue from his powerful position in the AME Church. He used his position as he was a manager of the African Methodist Episcopal Book Concern, which is a huge concern in the AME Church. And he used his sermons and essays to raise justice issues about reparations. These are only a few of the many voices that were being heard throughout the Civil War and the days of Reconstruction. We will continue to view the social change during the time of Reconstruction and the birth of the 20th century. One of the things that we will take a look at next time, we'll look at how the Ku Klux Klan becomes a part of the struggle that African Americans are dealing with. We also will look at how as we see the turn of the century, we will begin to take a look at the black migration, and we will take a look at how the blacks moved from the south to the north and why they moved from the south to north. We will talk a little about Jim Crow, and we'll talk about black codes. We'll talk about how the Jim Crow laws and the black codes began to pressure blacks in the South who were being freed after the Civil War from slavery. We'll see how they are pressured to move from the South to the North. Also, we will look at the development of the African American University, and as blacks become free, how the African American University plays a part in re-educating blacks to deal with the emergence of this new century, the 20th century. We will look at how nationalism and how the nationalistic leaders began to influence the development of the African American church, as well as the rise of Islam and eventually the civil rights movement. I will take you more through this process in our next session. Thank you.